This week's conversation touches on child sex trafficking. Please use discretion if there are children present.
The three main reasons why somebody would be the greatest risk of being trafficking or the most vulnerable are lack of education, breakdown of the family, and poverty. If a child comes from an extremely poor situation, then that is going to be a risk factor. If a child comes from a family that is not safe, let's say a parent's abusive or parents are never around or something where they don't have that adult that they're connecting with, that's a risk factor. A child not being in school, COVID, we saw during COVID where there was such a rising in children being abused.
The story is human trafficking is a problem for other people in other countries. But the truth is, it's a growing problem here in the United States, even as awareness increases. While the facts are horrific, there is hope for survivors, and there are things you can do. Today, we discuss shining a light on the darkness of human trafficking. I'm Joel Ackerman. This is Lightwise. For almost 8 years now, Jessica Mass has worked for O.U.R, Operation Underground Railroad, providing immediate and long-term care for survivors of human trafficking. In July this year, Angel Studios released the film Sound of Freedom, which tells the story of O.U.R's founder, Tim Ballard. Here's a clip from Sound of Freedom.
It has already passed the illegal arms trade, and soon it's going to pass the drug trade. You want to know why? Because you can sell a bag of cocaine one time, but a child, the most precious child, you can sell a 5-year-old kid 5 to 10 times a day for 10 years straight. And everyday ordinary people, they don't want to hear it. It's too ugly for polite conversation.
Jessica, thank you so much for joining us. Until I began meeting with Jim Caviezel and some other human trafficking activists, I was very averse to even learning about it. And as I started talking about these details with my wife, she had kind of the same experience. Don't tell me about it. It's too disturbing. Is this why there's not more awareness, or are there other factors at play?
I think that's a huge factor because you're right. When you start talking about it, people don't want to listen because it is graphic oftentimes. It is violent. It is something that people try to pretend like it's not happening. And I think specifically the fear comes up of, well, what if that actually did happen to my child? And people can't even go there. And so I think there's a lot of fears that come up in people's minds as they start to talk about trafficking or learn about human trafficking. And it does not matter if I'm in the most safe place in the United States or I'm in Thailand, which is known for sex tourism. Everyone wants to feel like it doesn't happen in their own backyard or in their community. And so I think that's one of the reasons why they don't want to talk about it. The other reasons, I think, are there are people involved in trafficking that could get exposed. And so whether that's through child explicit material known as CSAM or people engaging in different buying of sex with people where it's like, well, I don't want to learn about it because of that. And I think that there are multiple reasons where you can say, well, it's too graphic, it's too awful, I don't want to think it could happen to my kids. Or there's people that are engaged in these different acts of buying sex in some form.
And you're saying that there's enough of those people that that's a big portion of why people aren't learning about it because it's too close to home? Is that what you're kind of saying?
I think that there is more of that than we would realize. And it starts with everything from what used to be called child pornography, where people are engaging in that. The rise of that in America is insane. Like, I don't think that people really realize what is happening to our kids here and how many people are engaging in that specifically.
Can you give us any facts or figures to illustrate that idea? Because I think it is important, because to your point, the people that I've just begun to, again, I'm very new to this, kind of educating myself about this issue, but as I've tried to open this topic up to other people, there is this idea like, well, thankfully, this doesn't happen very much in the U.S. Or, like this is something that happens in third world countries kind of thing.
Well, America is one of the largest consumers and producers of CSAM, child sexual abuse material. One of the largest people that are engaging in this as a group, as a nation, is America, meaning we are creating this and then we're distributing it, we're selling it, we're taking our children and we're using them as objects. And so I think even just knowing that we're one of the number one producers and consumers of child sexual abuse material should be alarming to everyone, because that's us, that's our backyard, and people do it from their own home. A lot of times it's family members that are doing this to their children, or it's a neighbor, or it's a spiritual leader, or it's a coach, people that we think would be keeping our children safe. We just had a case where we were supporting the survivors by helping them with all their aftercare, but it was a teacher in Texas, and he taught at an all-girls school. He taught at a few different schools, but one of the schools that he taught at was an all-girls leadership academy school, and he would travel to other countries in order to abuse children and film it and hurt them. And then he finally got caught, which is another thing that I hope people in America start to realize, whether you're doing it to your children here, distributing this material, selling your children in different forms, or you're traveling to other countries, that eventually, as people start to say, I want to know, I want to engage in understanding what human trafficking is, you will get caught. And so I think the spreading the awareness of what it is in general and how big of a problem it is in the United States will help, hopefully, people say, if they have some type of an addiction, such as, let's say they're consuming pornography and it comes to, well, I need something else. I need the next greatest endorphin hit. And they're saying, okay, well, now I need to look at children that are being abused. And I hope that what people would do is say, I need help, and actually go to one of the many resources in the United States that will help people with different types of sex addictions.
Wow. Okay, so for people, that's a certain segment. If you're addicted to pornography and you start feeling like you need a bigger dose or a stronger dose or whatever, something like that, then they can seek help. For people who aren't in that boat, but people who want to stop and help catch these people and stop the tide of human trafficking in the United States, what can they look for? Are there visual cues? We see visual cues of drug problems. We see visual cues of homelessness, poverty. What are the visual cues? What can people look for?
One thing I would say is people start looking. That would be the first thing. Start being aware. Start noticing things at your kid's school or your kid's friends, and don't think that because a child is so young that they're not at risk or they could potentially be a victim. The youngest survivor I've ever worked with was 3 months old, to put it in perspective. And so when we start to think, well, that happens to girls that are 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, yes, that is true. But the youngest I've worked with is 3 months old. And that's not the only case of a child under a year old that I've worked with. So I think taking down these ideas that the only thing that is human trafficking is the movie Taken. That's not what human trafficking solely is. Some of the signs that people can look for is if a child's self-esteem suddenly changes, or a teenager suddenly they change personalities, or they have expensive things such as the latest iPhone where The parent has no idea where they got that, but now they suddenly have new clothes, new phones, all these things that they know the child can't afford, but somehow they've gotten possession of these things. A lot of times people that are being trafficked are told to not look people in the eyes because the traffickers don't want any type of signals going to somebody else that there could be something happening. And so when somebody won't make eye contact with you, obviously that doesn't mean they're being trafficked.
Sure.
But there are signs, there's red flags that people can look for as far as to self-esteem, possessions that they couldn't afford normally, not making eye contact, their schedule suddenly changes, or they're super protective of different things like their social media or something like that. So I would say to parents, be aware of what's on your kids' cell phones, on your kids' computers, and be engaged. You need to look at these things, not just because of being a parent, but because there are predators that are trying to come after kids. They have no limits when they're saying, oh, that child's 3 months old, or that girl's 15 years old, or that boy is 10 years old. They don't care. They're there to specifically traffic and use these children. An example would be even with the video games. I played Super Mario Brothers growing up.
Sure.
So I've never thought of video games as being something that would be dangerous. But now we have all these chats on the side. And I've worked with so many kids now that have been trafficked based on these chats on these video games. There was a kid that was around 7 years old that was on a little kids game, but it had a chat on it. And there was somebody that said, I'm the same age as you, started connecting with him. Oh, I love this game too. All these things that it's like, oh, we're building a connection. Well, on the other side of that is a 40-year-old man that's trying to groom this little boy and to lure him to a certain location so that he can either sexually abuse him, maybe film him, take pictures of him without clothing on, or kidnap him and then use him as in sexual ways.
Okay, so those are some good tips for, looking for children who might be trafficked, signs of children or teenagers, any age, as you said. What about predators? Are there signs to identify predators, people who might be predators? Again, we don't want to be, like you said, any one of these signs or red flags doesn't mean it's happening, and we don't want to be overreactionary. But just to be, as you said, looking for it, be concerned maybe when you see the signs, maybe dig a little deeper. But same thing with predators. Are there signs or red flags that we should be aware of?
I'll be honest, I wish that there were a specific set of signs that said this person's a predator. But honestly, I have seen predators, like I had mentioned, where it's a teacher, or it's a spiritual leader, or it's the person that you say would never hurt a child. They're so safe to be around. So there's not specific things where you can say that person's a predator. There are things that you can start to notice about people. If they have odd behavior, that anything that makes you think, well, maybe there is something going on, I would say listen to your gut. Don't deny that. But there's not specific things that you can say they're a predator. Over 50% of kids that are sexually abused, trafficked, sexually exploited, it's a family member. And it's way higher than 50%. That's a conservative number.
You mentioned predators using cell phones and chats to target, groom kids, those kind of things. Do you ever go, why are we giving kids cell phones and access to chats, period? Not that certainly in every case that's what's happening. There's many cases where it's just good, clean fun. But are you ever surprised at parents giving such young kids access to these?
It's shocking. I can understand that it is very difficult to be a parent, and I don't want to minimize that. It's difficult when your kids are saying, I hate you, I'm the only one at school that doesn't have a cell phone. All these like dramatic things that parents are dealing with day in and day out. But I would say, parents, please do not give your kids cell phones, because especially at these young ages, they don't know how to manage that. They still have such an innocence about them that they don't think anybody would ever try to reach out and groom them. Especially, you have these young teenagers that they're already trying to figure out who they are, their self-esteem. And then you have somebody that comes in and says with like one word, "You're so beautiful," or "You're beautiful," "You're pretty." These types of phrases that will capture somebody and start to draw them in. There are so many examples I could give of how kids and teenagers have been trafficked or blackmailed through their cell phone. And I think it used to be stranger danger was kind of the phrase. And if you're outside your home, then that's when you need to be worried and scared and teach your kids so much about that situation.
Yeah.
And now it's come into the home. It's literally in everybody's hands. It's in people's bedrooms usually. Why a child would ever be allowed to have a cell phone in their bedroom was beyond me. Because to me, I've seen so many kids when they're lonely at night or they need somebody to validate them. You've got your phone right there and you have access to literally anything. And I've seen traffickers reach out through every form of media possible. Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, and I could go on, where they'll get a girl. We had I believe she was 10 or 11, a girl to film herself in the bathroom. And she was innocent. She wasn't thinking anything of it. But now he has that video, and now he's selling that video to make money off of her. And now he's saying, if you don't give me more of these videos, I'm going to send this to your parents. I'm going to post this online. I'm going to make sure the kids at your school see this. And that's all through a cell phone. And it seems like it's so simple, but it's in a lot of ways, it's giving a child something that they don't know how to manage, nor do they know how to keep themselves safe.
Yeah, this is, you saw my cell phone. I don't use a smartphone, and it is a great tool because I'm able to say to my kids, hey, I don't have a smartphone. You don't need a smartphone. And it becomes very difficult for them to argue. And they also see a values thing. So I apologize for getting on my soapbox about this a little bit, but I am always a little bit flabbergasted that there hasn't been more caution amongst parents considering more deeply what they're doing when they give their kids a cell phone. And that there's just been such, I have kids in elementary school whose friends have cell phones. And it seems like there's been documentaries about how this is harmful to kids. Their brains are still developing. Too much dopamine. They become addicted to it. And it just seems that what you're saying, should be, and I hope it is, the straw that breaks the camel's back for a lot of parents to even if they've given a cell phone, to maybe take a step back, talk to their kids and say, hey, for all these reasons, including this reason, we're gonna pull back the cell phone use, and we'll give you a flip phone or something else. The challenge with flip phones is even a lot of flip phones have internet access, right? So anyway, I apologize for getting on my soapbox about that, but I'm always amazed that there's not a little bit more pause in just rolling out these new technologies to kids. Everything you've described so far, and we may later in the interview get into even some more detail about what's going on in this issue, but it's very disturbing. I mean, again, you've shared new details to me that about 3-month-olds and just the way this happened. It's all very ugly. I'm wondering why this cause, when it seems like the most innocent among us, the children, are being abused, manipulated, sometimes molested, raped, terrible things happening to them, and all over the world. I don't know if you know how many kids a year are subjected to this, but why isn't this the number one cause?
That is a great question. The estimated number is 2 million children that are being trafficked. That's the estimated number.
Worldwide?
Worldwide.
Okay.
Yeah. And so why isn't this being talked about more? Why is this not everybody's number one cause? And I agree, I'm biased. But my bias didn't come from working for O.U.R. It was way before that. When I was a foster parent, I worked with kids that had been sexually exploited, trafficked, severe sexual abuse. So it's not that it's just because I work for a nonprofit that specifically focuses on that. I think one of the reasons why people don't focus in on this being their passion and mission is because they're not willing to give up some of their own innocence. It's very difficult to think about it to the extent of this is something I'm going to be a part of fighting and I'm going to be a part of the solution, because you actually have to engage in the concept of what it is. And I think the idea of a child being raped for money and being used and a dollar sign put over their head is so horrific that people want to focus on other things. Especially if it's like, well, I gave money to this charity and now they're taking care of the problem. And we're saying, give money to charities. That's great. Like, be a part of that solution and donations, but also be a part of the solution and watching out for your own children, making changes in your own life, and really understanding and being educated on what trafficking is. I think that that's hard for people to say, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to give up some of my innocence. And why it's not the number one news story every day and we're talking about other things such as what celebrity is wearing what,
Right.
boggles my mind. Because I think the more media talks about this issue, the more that we are willing to engage fully in helping be a part of the solution, even when you feel helpless. Even when you feel like, I don't know what to do, there couldn't be a solution, but you say, I'm going to fight through that to figure out what I can do. I think that that's where change happens, but it has to be something that the media is willing to engage with too.
Yeah.
And not just overlook where they're like, oh yeah, kids are being abused and on with the next celebrity,
Right.
da-da-da-da-da. It's like, these are our kids. And I think sometimes people, whether it's what television shows or movies they're consuming personally, and they don't want to watch documentaries or movies on trafficking. I think part of it is because it hasn't hit home yet, or they don't know the kids in their circle that are being abused. And sometimes, sadly, it takes a personal encounter with a child that's being abused where they finally say, I'm going to rise up and do something.
And I agree with you. I think a lot of people don't want to face those documentaries because, again, it's very dark. They want to protect their own innocence. Fiction has a way of breaking down some of those barriers sometimes. For an example, the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin kind of exposed slavery. People knew slavery was going on. Obviously, it was a political issue for decades in the United States, but Uncle Tom's Cabin kind of exposed and made people kind of rise up and start feeling even more, there were always abolitionists, but even more passionate about, okay, we really need to put a stop to this slavery thing. Are there, you mentioned Taken, and Sound of Freedom is a fictionalized but based on Tim Ballard's true experience story, so there will be that as well. Are there any other fiction stories that you're aware of, fiction or based on a true story but not presented in documentary fashion, that you're aware of about this issue? Or is literally Taken and the Taken series and Sound of Freedom it?
They're not the only ones. I think that even within some of the the television shows, you'll start to see, okay, that's a form of trafficking. Once people understand that that's what's being communicated. I believe Jack Ryan, the TV series, I think that had some of the like specific forms of trafficking within it, and they focused in on that.
I think an episode of The Blacklist featured this. I wanted to ask about that specifically. In that episode, I think there was charity or some group that was supposedly fighting human trafficking that was engaged in it. Obviously, that's a very disturbing storyline as well. Do you ever worry about that kind of thing happening?
Oh, I've worked with that. I've worked with people that are a nonprofit that are specifically there to abuse and traffic children. So when that episode of The Blacklist, to me, that's real. That's when I watch that, and sometimes it's hard for me to watch some of these documentaries because I watch it and there's a real person attached to it. And so something like that where I'm like, oh, you mean the spiritual leader that did that? Oh, you mean the nonprofit that went to such and such country? I could give examples of so many of those different types of specific charities that have posed as being these great people. We're here to help. We're here to give you food. We're here to give you education. And they use it in a form of manipulation. It's exactly what traffickers do. They're grooming them, and yet they're going in as, we're the good guys. We're here to help you. And yet in reality, they are there to abuse and traffic those children.
Wow. So clearly, again, it behooves us as parents and members of society to do as you said, not only look for charities, but to kind of take our own actions in looking for these red flags, seeing what we can do about it. But for the parent out there who wants to support a group like O.U.R, Operation Underground Railroad, or another charity, is there any way to know? I mean, how do you know a good charity from a bad charity?
It's very difficult. I think one way that I would recommend is start volunteering with them. If you are up close and personal, you're going to know what they're all about in general. You're going to know what it is that they support, what they don't, the why. It's always nice if you can actually know somebody that works at the charity, but that's not the reality for most people.
Right.
But I would say you can volunteer with them. I think do your due diligence to the best that you can as well. The other thing that I've seen too is when people go on humanitarian trips or different things like that, is that they'll have volunteers that then go and sexually abuse or hurt the children while they're volunteering on a humanitarian trip. And so one of the things that we do in order to prevent that is we're extremely overprotective. We don't believe that kids should be animals in a zoo that you'd go and look at or anything close to that. So there's ways to volunteer where you're keeping the children's best interest at heart and in mind, and yet you're still helping and supporting them. The vetting process for somebody to come with us on any type of humanitarian trip is extensive, to say the least. And I've been accused many times of being overprotective, but that's another kind of similar example where it's not a charity, but it's an individual that's trying to use a charity to get to vulnerable children to then abuse them.
Wow. But again, it just makes me think, like you said, giving to charities is great if you can feel good about the charity you're giving to, but really the best thing you can do is to take actions into your own hands and look for these signs yourself, although it makes you have to think about this, on a regular basis, which is uncomfortable if you're not. Did you struggle with that at first? You mentioned being a foster parent and first becoming exposed to children who had been sexually exploited. Did it take you a while to get a thicker skin to kind of endure these stories and endure these dirty details as they come out?
The first time I had a child come and live with me that had been trafficked, when I got her case file, I sobbed. She was 6 months old and had been trafficked by her family and had been filmed, and the abuse that went into her case. I just sat there and sobbed as I was reading it. It broke me to the core because I didn't believe that that could actually happen. It's like reading a horror movie, and yet you know it's true, and that child is in the bedroom in your home sleeping. So that broke me. And I think working with her, though, and working with several of the different children that I had the privilege of working with while they were living with me, it taught me a lot of the healing process and what that actually looks like for a child to heal and on that journey of healing after they've been trafficked. And if I was to have thicker skin, that would be what it came from, is that I truly believe that there's hope for every kid. I truly believe that no matter what you've been through, that if there's still breath in your lungs, there's hope for healing. And we work with kids that have been through child sacrifice. It's an awful situation where a child is kidnapped or sold, and then they're sold from one person to another, and eventually I won't get into a lot of the details, but they use their blood and their different body parts, and then they sell that for a blessing, and somebody buys that and they put that on their business or their home for a blessing, the child's body parts and blood. And so when I read that, though, it broke me again. I mean, I can remember I made the mistake of reading this child's, the first child I ever worked with that had gone through child sacrifice. I was at Barnes & Noble reading their case. And I mean, people around me must have thought I was crazy because I was just crying and sobbing over what happened to this child. But then I go to that home, that aftercare home, and the kids are playing soccer in the front yard. And they're talking about what they're doing at school. And they're showing me the craft that they made, as if I was at a normal elementary school. And they're just showing me all the different things that they're doing, and they're at recess. And so I think what has given me thick skin through all the different things is the belief that there's healing and the belief that there's hope. And my job is to walk alongside survivors and to empower them with what their dreams are and how to get to a point of healing.
I think that's so important for people to understand. And thank you for sharing, because I think if you think that it's just this kind of hopeless situation where, well, maybe you can get out, but what kind of life can they have afterwards? They're just going to, be destroyed and broken the rest of their lives. And if you don't believe that there can be healing, then it's really probably much harder to face this issue and to feel like you can do anything about it. So talk to me about that. I know, so you've been director of aftercare, supporting victims of human trafficking after they've been rescued. What are the various types of, what forms does that support take?
Yes. Well, first of all, it's an honor to work with survivors. They teach me so much, and they really are the heroes. They're the ones that are fighting the battles day in and day out. Some of the things that we are able to support them with is, we call it wraparound services or holistic. So education, mental health, home, whether that's going to be in an actual aftercare home or if that's going to be with a family member or a therapeutic foster parent. We help with all of those different sides of things. We also work with the individual. We believe very strongly that healing looks different for everyone, and we involve survivors leading that, saying, what is it that you feel like you need? So, for example, some survivors love equine therapy or horse therapy. That's very healing for them. For other survivors, they don't want anything to do with animals. For some survivors, they love yoga, and yoga really helps them heal. For other survivors, it's your traditional therapy, going to somebody's office and working with them. One of the things that I love that we do, though, is we do community integration and community outings. And I think sometimes we forget that that's a part of healing, is having these positive outings in the community. We don't want survivors to feel like they're institutionalized,
Right.
trapped inside these four walls. This is it. Because I was trafficked, I don't get to go into society. But we do everything from swim parties to taking them to their favorite restaurant for their birthdays, and everything in between, shopping, taking survivors shopping, or taking them to whatever it is that they've never had. We just worked with a survivor. It was, we worked with her for a long time, but it was her birthday a couple weeks ago. And I said to her, what do you want to do to celebrate your birthday? Like, anything. Tell me what is your dream to how to celebrate your birthday? And she said, I don't know. I've never had my birthday celebrated. And so it's things like that where you start to focus in on what is it that individual needs. Another thing that I absolutely love is seeing survivors go to college and to university if that's their dream. You think about somebody that never thought that was an option, and then you see them going to their whatever college class. We have a survivor that was rescued in 2018, and she just started university a few months ago, and she's going to school to become a social worker because she wants to help kids that have been through what she's been through. And so we pay for her to go to university. So it could be literally anything, but we really try to meet survivors where they're at, whether that's helping them get rent for a month where they need to get back on their feet, helping them with job placement, helping them with actually rebuilding their ecosystem, because you have to rebuild friends and where you go to shop, like all these different things that we don't think about. Or somebody that wasn't able to get a driver's license, and that's what's stopping them from getting a job, and that's what's stopping them from all these other different things. So it could be literally anything that the survivor needs.
That's awesome. And it's great to hear those stories of them getting overcome and do things that then turn around and help other people. It's really beautiful. Can parents take any kind of comfort in and or see signs, look for signs if kids are from a less stable situation?
The three main reasons why somebody would be the greatest risk of being trafficking or the most vulnerable are lack of education, breakdown of the family, and poverty. If a child comes from an extremely poor situation, then that is going to be a risk factor. If a child comes from a family that is not safe, let's say a parent's abusive, or the parents are never around, or something where they don't have that adult that they're connecting with, that's a risk factor. A child not being in school, COVID, we saw during COVID where there was such a rising in children being abused and children being used for child sexual abuse material. So there is those types of connections where you can say, here's some factors of a child that might be more at risk than others. Throughout the world, including the United States, there are movements that are trying to say that a child, if they can choose what their favorite color is, if they can choose their favorite ice cream, they can choose to engage in sex. So it's consensual. So if you have an 8-year-old that says, here's my favorite color, here's my favorite ice cream, that's what I want this, then if they're raped, it's consensual, and therefore it's not sexual abuse and even into trafficking. And there's a movement to do this.
Yeah, who's pushing this movement? I mean, and where is this like a pro? I read something about a pro pedophilia kind of group. Is that
Exactly?
Is this a public movement? Like people are out there saying, "Hey, this is a legitimate."
It is not underground. I was speaking at a conference a few years ago. It was all therapists. So it was a group of therapists, and I'm talking about child abuse, child rape, trafficking, all these things. And I had a group of them, of these therapists, come up to me afterwards and say, how dare you say that a child could be raped? How dare you say that that could happen? Because that's consensual, because that child chose that. And I was so appalled and confused because it was the first time I had heard somebody say that, and from a group of educated people that are also providing therapy for kids.
Right.
And so it's not an underground movement. And I think that people start to hear more about it when, throughout the coming years. But that is an actual movement that's happening where it's saying child sex, child rape is consensual. And so then you look at our legal system and you look at laws, and then you look at how judges are going to have to then respond to saying, well, that was consensual. That 10-year-old child, that 8-year-old child, that 6-year-old child chose that. And then as a parent, then what do you say? What do you say? My kid was raped or my kid was trafficked, but the law and the movement was something that people overlooked. And we sexualized our children, and we intentionally have put sex in front of our kids so that we think now that there's no safety for them, that there's no penalties if our kids are abused. And then what kind of society does that create long term is just, it's terrifying.
Yeah, to answer your question, I have no idea what you say. It's flabbergasting to me. And again, the word I just keep coming back to is very disturbing. And I do wonder how we got here to where there are, like you said, educated people who don't just on its surface see that this is madness, or worse than madness, just pure evil. How you can't just kind of instinctually understand that, no, there's no way that that's a good idea. Do you have an opinion about, I'm just curious, do you have an opinion about how it got there?
There's so many things. My personal opinion is that as people have engaged more with child sexual abuse material, formerly known as child pornography, I think that has had a huge factor into it. I think that there's been the slippery slope effect where the breakdown of any type of family unit, whether that's one loving, caring parent involved in a child's life or two or whatever that looks like, but there's no longer this protection around children where they're saying, we're going to have dinner with you at the table. That's what I'm talking about with the breakdown of the family, is we're not going to have dinner together. I'm going to work 90 plus hours a week, so I don't actually know what's even going on in my kid's life. I gave them smartphones, so now their face is in their phone the whole time. So what am I supposed to do? Those are the types of things that I'm talking about, where it's like, these do have effects. That's not just something that you can have happen in a society and there's no impact.
The great thing about what you're saying is that if that is, and I think I agree with you, right, that the breakdown of the family at that very basic human connection level, not just divorce or whatever, but at that basic human connection level is so crucial. Well, then the opposite is true, which is if we strengthen that, then we help protect against it. That's encouraging because it gives us something else that we can do, which is, not to get on my soapbox again, but to put down the phones or take away the phones, better yet, turn off the TV, turn off YouTube, turn off the video games, spend time engaging with your children. Don't worry maybe so much about making so much money. I taught a children's class at my church, and I asked the kids, how many of you wish your parents or, your parents or your dad worked less? Every kid raised their hand. None of them were like, well, no, I think it's good because then he can buy me more stuff. None of them cared about that. They all wanted to spend, and these are church families, right? But they all wish their dad spent more time with them at home. And that's not to say their dads don't spend a good amount of time, but they all would like more. And it's encouraging because I think if we can allow ourselves to go, let's not worry so much about money and giving our kids the shiny new toy that all their other friends have. Let's worry about spending time together as a family. And if we can do that, certainly we'll strengthen our own family and protect our own family. And if we each do that, then we can strengthen society and hopefully take, again, roll back some of what we've lost in some of this.
I couldn't agree more. I think having dinner together, playing board games together.
We play kickball in the backyard is what I do with my kids.
Love it. Those are the types of things that when repeated and done day in and day out, they really do have an impact. And your kids are more likely to talk to you if something is going on. And it really does have a ripple effect because you have maybe more kids coming over to your house and now they're seeing that it can be done differently. Maybe they take that back to their families and they're saying, hey, Mom, Dad, could you put down your cell phone for a little bit? Could we have dinner at the table together? Because I saw it modeled at this other home.
Yeah.
But I think that those are the simple things, even if, and it's simple examples, but I remember my mom and my brother and I going and having lunch with my dad on his lunch break at work growing up. And so that still sticks in my mind where it was so simple, but I knew that there were things that were built into my family culture that were specifically strengthening our family. And I think that those are the types of things that really actually battle a larger issue.
The Operation Underground Railroad got its name, right, from the Underground Railroad, which Harriet Tubman and others ran in freeing kind of slaves from the South, agricultural slaves, right? So they've drawn this comparison to the kind of slavery that exists with child trafficking to that kind of slavery. Well, as I've thought about that comparison, I just want to kind of explore that a little bit and see if you had a sense of looking forward to the future, what we can hope on this issue. So obviously, slaves were used early on in the colonial America. But if we look at, let's say, 1787 with the implementation of the Constitution, where slavery was really allowed for legally, right, with the 3/5 Compromise and those kind of things, it was tolerated legally up until 1863 with the Emancipation Proclamation, or 1865, the 13th Amendment, which made slavery illegal. So that's a period of about 80 years. If we're looking at this issue, obviously there's some differences. Number one, it's not legal, at least in the United States. Ostensibly, it's not legal, right? As far as I understand and hope, although it sounds like there's movements to change that too. Where are we on that spectrum between, people basically accepting it and tolerating it to eradicating it? Do you have any sense or idea or hope that we might be only 80 years away from eradicating this, but because it happens in the dark, not openly, the way agricultural slavery did, and domestic slavery, is there ever an end in sight to it, or will it always be a problem?
Such a hard question because I can see both sides. I can see where there's more people that are rising up. There's more people that are getting educated and understanding what human trafficking is. And yet on the other side, I see so much of the sexual perversion that continues to happen and that kids are being used. And so where we're at on that spectrum, I would say if there isn't significant change in people's personal and daily lives, that we're not close to ending it. It's something that, for one, it's people making choices that are different than what they can do in the dark. It's integrity is usually defined as what you do when nobody else is watching, when you don't think you're going to get caught. People have to rise up in their integrity as a society, as a nation, as a worldwide movement is we have to go back to some of those basic principles. Do I care about my integrity? Will I fight for it? Will I do whatever it takes to be a person that is striving for a lack of a better word, righteousness? And there is more of this leaning towards, I'm going to do whatever feels good in the moment. I'm going to do whatever's pleasurable for me. And unfortunately, there's people that suffer for that. You know, I've talked to people that have consumed child sexual abuse material, and they say, well, I wasn't hurting anyone. I was just watching it online. And to me, I'm saying, well, let me tell you about the kid behind that you were consuming, and you were using them for your own gratification. Their life is destroyed. Or even these young adults, these women that I've worked with that were forced to do this. And in the United States, I've worked with so many girls that have been forced to perform these different videos and things like that. And I'm like, their life was destroyed. How many girls have I worked with that have lost their lives because of this? That they've lost their life to suicide or depression or all these different disorders. And so I think that if integrity will rise and that there's a movement of character, that's what will actually help change where we're at. But if we don't have that, I don't see an end in sight as far as human trafficking. I see it actually growing and it being something that continues to be one of the fastest growing criminal enterprises in the world.
Thank you so much again for all you're doing for the survivors, most of all. And also thank you for joining us, Jessica.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Sound of Freedom is currently playing in theaters everywhere. Get tickets at angel.com/tickets. Be sure to check out last week's episode with star Jim Caviezel, or to learn more about Sound of Freedom, watch the episode with director Alejandro Monteverde. Lightwise is a video podcast production of Angel Studios, released every other Tuesday. To watch more episodes or be notified of new episodes of Lightwise, click subscribe or download the Angel app now, wherever you get your apps. If you'd prefer to listen instead of watch, you can find the Lightwise audio podcast version wherever you get your podcast. This episode of Lightwise was hosted by Joel Ackerman. It was written and directed by Joel Ackerman, produced by Cameron Jackson and John Shea Van Sickle, and edited by Cameron Jackson, with sound recording by GARRETT BRIGGS and sound mixing by BRYAN DENSLEY.